Welcome. I know you're all here for the air conditioning, and that's fine. Welcome, everyone, to L.R. Wilson Hall, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Tonight's event is a fitting finale to the 2018-19 season of over 30 talks, town halls, and leadership programs and cultural offerings of the Socrates Project. My name is Rena Fraticelli, and I have the privilege and pleasure of being the director of the Socrates Project and of asking you if you would take a moment to turn off your cell phones. The Statue Wars, tonight's event, is a partnership with the Wilson Institute for Canadian History's summer school on teaching history in precarious times. And it addresses an important and very timely question, and that is our evolving understanding of and engagement with the past. Guiding us and introducing our three eminent speakers is the multi-talented journalist, author, documentary filmmaker, and anchor of TV Ontario's flagship public affairs program, The Agenda, Hamilton's own Steve Paikin. The recipient of honorary doctorates from no fewer, at last count, than 4 universities, including, of course, McMaster. Steve is also Chancellor of Laurentian University. It's a great pleasure to welcome him home. There's someone else I would really like to welcome home before turning the mic over to Steve and his panelists. I have the honor to introduce a man whose contribution to this country and this community cannot be overstated. As many of you are aware, our community has been enormously blessed by the generosity and vision of Chancellor Emeritus Linton Red Wilson. His long-standing generosity has made possible not only this vibrant and beautiful building, but such ambitious and influential initiatives as the Wilson Leadership Scholars Awards, the Wilson Institute for Canadian History, and most recently, and especially dear to my heart, the Socrates Project. Chancellor Emeritus Wilson's deep appreciation for the value of classical liberal arts education underlies each of these gifts. Also underlying them is the principle that a liberal education does not hive us off from the world. Rather, it prepares us to contribute to society and to better take on our responsibility to ensure that our society flourishes. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage McMaster Chancellor Emeritus Wilson.
Thank you so much, Rena, for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here tonight to be with you all, and I'm amazed that so many are here with a beautiful evening like this outside. Summer has only begun recently, and I'm delighted to see you all here this evening. Thank you for coming. In 1967, McMaster won an international bidding war for the archives of the iconic British philosopher Bertrand Russell. If you were to explore the Russell archives today, you would soon encounter his skeptical essays. Written 91 years ago, Russell asserted in the essays, and I quote, that it is undesirable to believe a proposition when there is no ground whatever for supposing it is true. If such an opinion became common, it would completely transform our social life and our political system. Unquote. Today in 2019, we should perhaps consider Dr. Russell's warning. We live in a world where many people trust anonymous comments without understanding the background behind them. Many people consume all the news that's fit to print, as long as it fits in 280 characters. There's a long-held and often argued adage that history is written by the victors. And to our credit as a society, the guardianship of history has never been more diverse or democratic. If the victors did indeed once hold a monopoly on history, that monopoly has been transformed into countless images, facts, and opinions broadcast widely by the media and the World Wide Web. So while it has never been easier to access diverse views of facts and alternative formulations of opinion, it has also never been more important that we as a society also construct historical frameworks and contexts. It has become imperative that we encourage historical education so our citizens have the tools to comprehend the deluge of information and opinion that arrives on our screens every day. Looking through this lens at the issue of the evening, statue wars, I hope it's obvious to advocates on all sides of any debate that we owe it to ourselves to build those debates on appropriate understanding. Let's explore and learn before we decide. Let's attempt to understand before we conclude. That's why I am interested in the exploration, teaching, and learning of history, particularly Canadian history, and why it's so rewarding to see all of you participating in this evening's discussion. I offer my thanks to the teams from the Socrates Project, Rena, and the Wilson Institute, Ian Mackay, for arranging this important workshop, to Steve Paikin for moderating the session, and to James Daschuk, Christopher Moore, and Vanessa Watts as members of the round table. Also, let me thank and congratulate all of you for participating. Activities like this should be a fundamental aspect of our global citizenship, and I'm honored to play a small role in supporting your efforts. Thank you.
It's probably very bad form to quibble with the Chancellor Emeritus as the first thing that comes out of my mouth after his speech, but I'm going to. You have not played a small role at all in what we're embarking on this evening. You have played a huge role in what's transpired over the past season and what we're going to do tonight. There are a lot of people in our community who have done very well. There are fewer who have done good. You've done well, and you've done a lot of good. So hats off to Chancellor Emeritus Wilson. There we go. And can I also say, you're not the only VIP in the house here, because sitting 2 seats over from you is my mother. Hello, Marnie Paikin is here tonight. All right. Sorry guys, I'm going to get to you in a second, but I don't get home that often, and well, actually, I get home quite a bit, actually, now that I think of it. But it's always ironic. I don't get to McMaster that often, and it's ironic when I am asked to do something here at McMaster, because this was the one university in the entire country that my parents forbade me from attending. I'm born and raised in Hamilton, and they always said, "Kid, you got to get out of the city. You got to go somewhere else." So I do have a degree from this university, but I didn't really earn it. It's just an honorary degree. But it's lovely to be here anyway. Okay, the one thing that I suspect we can all agree on tonight is that the Ticats are off to a great start this year. They are 3-0, and They are playing Montreal tonight, and if you want to sneak a look on your smartphones, the game starts in about 15 minutes, so we'll understand. But while we're all agreed on that, I suspect there is lots more to debate with the topic at hand, and I noticed about a week and a half ago, the New York Times, as Confederate statues topple, cities ponder what to do with them. This is a big issue, what to do with these statues, not just here, obviously, not just across our country, but all over the world, as citizens grapple with what to do with this situation. And fortunately, we have three very smart people here tonight who are going to engage in a discussion about this. You have lengthy biographies of all of them in your program tonight, so I won't repeat what you already know, other than to say thank you for coming tonight to James Daschuk, Christopher Moore, and Vanessa Watts, and would you welcome them to McMaster University this evening. There we go. We are going to discuss tonight's topic up here for a bit, and then at a certain point, I think we're going to have people running around the audience with microphones, and we'll get you involved in this so that you can participate, put your questions to the panelists, and we'll get that going, when it feels about right. So, let's go. There are statues of historical figures all over this country. Vanessa, in your view, do we need to reconsider the placement of some of these statues?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I think that, it was pointed out by Mr. Wilson that we're increasingly having a diverse view of history, big H history, and what's kind of gone into the historical record. And we're seeing a lot of challenges coming up, challenging views as to what has been accepted within Canada in terms of who, the Confederate fathers are of this nation and what they've done and all of the good deeds that they've done. And what we're having now is a space created for other truths to come out in terms of their contributions that are negative. And statues are living monuments that in effect idolize. They don't stand for someone who is infamous. They're not there to celebrate someone who's done something bad. Rather, they idolize. And so when we reflect on some of these key historical players within Canada and within the United States, and we critique them, and we start finding out about things that were never in the historical record, but that we, as, for example, Indigenous peoples know to be true, then that must be taken into account in terms of who's idolized and who should not be idolized anymore.
We will discuss how to take that into account as the evening goes on. James, your view on whether we need to reconsider the placement of some of the statues that are up in communities across this country.
Well, I think moving the statues or not moving the statues is a community decision. It will reflect the values of the community. But I think one thing is, talking about revisiting those statues, those are discussions we've got to have. They're necessary discussions. And actually, as a historian, I'm very happy to see them, even if they're heated, because it means that history matters. And so I think the far off goal of reconciliation, if that even exists, we're going to have these discussions about a whole lot more things than just statues.
Christopher.
I'm reluctant to start removing them. I think as an historian, I've come to the conclusion over the years that history is not a bag full of facts. History is an argument about the facts. And these statues are good for arguing with. Mm-hmm. If we took every contentious statue and put it in a warehouse somewhere, there's a lot of opportunities to debate the meaning of those people and the meaning of what they stood for and what they were once honored for. So, yeah, there are places when you want to remove a statue, or you want to maybe edit it with another statue about someone else not too far away. But just making any contentious statue disappear, I'm not keen on that, because I think we need to debate these issues, and if those statues are triggers for the debate, I'm kind of in favor of that. Vanessa,
are you denying us a trigger for debate by taking down some contentious statues?
Oh, no. I think the triggers are all around us. I don't necessarily say that all statues should be removed, but they should at least be interacted with. They cannot stand as kind of sanitary moments in time
What does that
anymore.
mean, interacted with?
Well, perhaps some defacing. We should really think about what defacing, but really think about what defacing means. When you take a name of someone like Sir Johnny McDonald and you put him on a school, that's not a piece of art. a statue is a piece of art. And my view is that art, and particularly political art, was intended for a reason to trigger. And so if you're going to trigger something, and triggering is important, I mean, who then gets to decide what the reaction should be in terms of ethics or the parameters of what's allowed and what's not allowed?
So let me understand this. It would be okay to demonstrate your opposition to Sir Johnny McDonald and his policies on Indigenous people. It would be okay to take a can of paint and dump it over his head. Am I hearing that right?
I'm saying that that's a trigger, that could be a triggered effect, yeah, absolutely.
And that's okay?
I'm saying that I think that, that's okay.
James, what's your view on that?
It's happened quite a bit, so it's pretty normalized. Like, the McDonald statue in Montreal is vandalized, if not on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis.
We know that, but is that okay?
Those are signs of conflict. Well, what it is it's people expressing their emotions. So if we remove the statues, that might be okay for one day, but the people who succeed in removing a statue will be paid back in spades by the people who are mad that the statue is removed, right? Mm-hmm. So is it okay? It's vandalism. Some people call it art. I personally wouldn't do it. I'd write a book.
Well, you did, actually. Yeah, you did. Christopher, there's a statue of Sir Johnny in Kingston, his, well, sort of his hometown, his adopted hometown, that has been sort of spray painted on a fairly regular basis. Oftentimes, either on Canada Day or close to his birthday.
For sure.
What do you think of this?
I think about a statue in Montreal of Paul Chomedy de Maisonneuve, who was the founder of Montreal. Great noble soldier, warrior, led these brave settlers. The statue, one of the things it celebrates about him is, in one battle, he killed 2 or 4 Mohawk warriors at the same time in defense of his people. There's a Mohawk educator in Montreal who says, I'm okay with that plaque, I'm okay with that statue. There ought to be a statue of the Mohawk chief right opposite him saying, this was his territory and his people's territory and his homeland for unknown eons. And these guys invaded it. They were defending their turf. They were defending the homes of their wives and children, and that ought to be acknowledged. And his argument that it would be better to have the 2 statues confronting each other would be better than removing the Chomedy de Maisonneuve acknowledgement, that has some weight with me. I kind of like that idea. And I'd probably think something the same about Johnny McDonald.
I wonder if that works for Vanessa. We don't have to take down Sir John A., but let's add something else.
Absolutely. In a sanitized version of a person, I don't think defacing can really be called unethical when it's bearing a truth that is not true. When it's a sanitized version of a person, and it's a statue and it's a piece of art. If there was someone standing in a statue next to Sir Johnny McDonald that would offer a moment of education for whoever came up and saw that monument, then I think that goes much further. But right now there is no point of education at Sir Johnny McDonald statues.
Does the vandalism or illegality aspect of it trouble you at all?
What troubles me is that it's a sanitized version of
I get that. But what about the notion that you're kind of condoning the destruction of public property in an attempt to make a point?
What I'm saying is I don't think it's wrong to do that when there are other options to make a point about education that are not being explored, that are not happening, and I do believe as a form of art that it should be interactive. I mean, he is a figure that has been grossly sanitized for over a century and idolized.
Not by James Daschuk.
Well, not, okay, so you're the exception, absolutely. There's some of us who are exceptions, sure. But the statue itself stands as a form of idolization.
Come on in, James.
So one of the things I was going to say, I'm going to quote my Métis fine arts scholar, David Garneau. He's a colleague of mine at University of Regina, where I live. And he said that those political statues are a way for one generation to impose their will and their vision on future generations. So it is a representation of power and a certain vision, sanitized or whatever, of the country. So I live in Regina, and we've got one of the last remaining McDonald statues. It's vandalized on a regular basis. the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. One of the calls to action, Regina is the provincial capital, if anybody didn't pass grade 6 civics. Every provincial capital is supposed to have some kind of commemoration, or they called for some kind of commemoration for children who experienced residential schools, survivors or those who didn't. So one of the things I proposed in a talk was, the McDonald statue is in a very prime position in Victoria Park, not far from the cenotaph, the center of town, was maybe facing the McDonald statue is we have some kind of monument, whatever is appropriate, to the residential schools kids. Now, to me, that almost creates more tension because you can't look, in this scenario, you wouldn't be able to look at McDonald without looking at the representation of the child or whatever that might be. So that might create more dissonance than even moving the statue. But that might be, like rather than just taking the statue away, you're creating like a visual dialogue that you can't get away from. I don't know how you feel about that.
I'm okay with a little dissidence, a little dialogue going on. That's okay with me. Yeah.
Does anybody get concerned at the notion that if you start creating competing representations, competing sculptures, that if you vandalize one, you're introducing the option of vandalizing the other as well, and is that really what we want? Vanessa?
That's not what we want. I mean, I think that even if you change the plaques or the many plaques that exist near the Sir John A. McDonald statues that exist now, that's still something to improve or create an educative moment for folks who visit that statue. And so I do worry about counter vandalism, et cetera, but I wouldn't see it as equal.
Not equal, but can you imagine how outrageous it would be to vandalize a sculpture of residential school children who survived that experience?
Absolutely.
But that's possible if we're opening the door to vandalism being acceptable, is it not?
It is if we have another statue or monument going up. It absolutely is. It absolutely is.
Go ahead, James.
Sorry to interrupt. I think that vandalism is an expression of they're pushing back against that vision. So if there's an alternative vision, the impetus to vandalize the statue is going to be at least diminished. It's for sure you could get somebody who, as a counterpoint will vandalize the residential school monument, but I think the reason for vandalizing it will be diminished because there's an alternative voice in that space.
Christopher.
I think there's a deeper issue than the statue, even when people are vandalizing, which broadly I don't encourage violence. We try not to be that kind of country, and people have tensions and people have angers and it bubbles up. But it seems to me what might persuade people to be less interested in pouring paint on a statue of McDonald or someone else is attention to the kind of issues that really creates those angers.
For example?
Well, the things that McDonald did, that James has documented brilliantly, I was reading in the Toronto Star today a very long story by a journalist I've never heard of before, by a Dene Nation from Northwest Territories, who were a group of wildlife officers in the 1950s decided they were a threat to the caribou. So they were basically rounded up and deported to, well, they didn't call it a concentration camp, but a little place just outside of Churchill, Manitoba, where they suddenly became prey. There was nothing to hunt. They weren't used to this area. They were rapidly led into poverty and illness, and they began dying at a tremendous rate. That's the kind of thing that James Daschuk demonstrates McDonald taking command responsibility for in the 1880s. It's gone on. It didn't stop in the 1880s. Sure. Canada's got to address these issues. To think that taking down a statue of Johnny McDonald begins to address that problem doesn't seem to me to be taking the problem seriously.
Maybe at this point I could get you, James, because your book, for an academic treatise, your book captured a heck of a lot of attention, certainly a disproportionate amount to the, you'll forgive me for saying it, but for many of the books that many professors at our universities write. It got a great deal of attention, but just in the chance that some people here aren't aware of the main thesis of your book, lay it out for us if you would.
Well, we're discussing the Prime Minister McDonald's legacy, and he really is My book is a longitudinal study of Indigenous health. So there's an ecological aspect, disease aspect, that kind of thing. And really, McDonald he's not a bit player, but he comes in the last couple chapters, and what he did was he reshaped the disease ecology of Indigenous people, putting them on reserves, withholding food if they didn't go to reserves, implementing an extra-legal pass system that functioned until the 1950s. So when we talk about legacies, he truly established the dysfunctional relationship that the state, many of us as citizens, have with Indigenous people. Like, he was the person that derailed. And this was within a couple years of the numbered treaties being signed in the territory I live in, Saskatchewan.
Now here's the thing though, without McDonald, there's no Canada. This is one of the most successful countries in the history of the world. Do you run the risk of having, if we have, as Vanessa says right now, a kind of singular sanitized vision of what Sir Johnny McDonald did, father of the country and so on, do you run the risk of overcorrecting and giving people an impression of McDonald that doesn't acknowledge that he's the founder of one of the great countries of all time?
Well, for most of us, he's the founder of the greatest country of all time.
Everything being relative, of course.
But for a significant percentage of people, it's not. Indigenous health outcomes, according to the World Health, United Nations Human Development Index, in First Nations health outcomes are equivalent to that of Romania. Like, these are our neighbors. And the path that McDonald set the country on continues to the present. So just when you mentioned, without McDonald, we may not have Canada. So that's kind of a counterfactual thing, like maybe yes, maybe no. But my rebuttal would be, what if McDonald had acted in good faith with regard to the treaties? We'd be in a very different country too.
And not hang Louis Riel and so on and so forth. How did you, as the guy who contributes so much to that history magazine, how do you look at that?
Canada's History, which I'm a continuing contributing editor. I'll pick up the next issue. Yeah. I was struck. I think we ought to expand this a little bit beyond McDonald. I don't want to avoid that. I definitely want to come back to McDonald. But as you said in your introduction, this is an issue that's going on all over the world, from statues of Stalin getting knocked down and put back up to all the disputes in the United States. I was really struck by a remarkable American woman called Annette GordonReed. And she is both a professor of law and a professor of history at Harvard, no less. She has a Genius Award, she has a Pulitzer Prize. She was the scholar, wrote an enormous book called The Hemmings of Monticello, and it really pinned down what people had always kind of suspected, but it was controversial, that Thomas Jefferson had a relationship with a slave woman called Sally Hemings over many years, and she bore many of his children. Thomas Jefferson created that phrase, we take these things as self-evident that all men are created equal. And Thomas Jefferson allowed his own children to be slaves on his plantation, the children that he fathered on Sally Hemings. And Annette GordonReed is not only a professor of law and a professor of history, she's also an African-American woman. And she was asked to participate in this debate. And she said, you got to judge the statue. She says, a Confederate general who is honored for treason in defense of slavery, I can see getting rid of that, particularly if the statue was put up 20 years ago and not actually when he died. And there's a lot of those in the US.
There's a lot of that, yes.
But she said Thomas Jefferson, he believed in slavery. He defended slavery. He had slaves. He fathered slaves. But he did some great things for the United States. He put forward this concept of equality, even if he didn't really practice it.
He wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly. Today's the 4th of July. Yeah. She defended Thomas Jefferson statues on the grounds that if the statues recognize someone's achievement, then they're worth retaining. If they only represent something that's entirely reprehensible. And now I want to get back to Johnny McDonald.
Okay.
Would you throw me off the stage if I started talking about the Constitution?
Would I throw you out? No.
Okay.
Now, I haven't asked them yet. But,
Bear with me a moment. There's nothing in the Constitution about the Indian Act, but McDonald and actually his liberal followers and successors thought the Indian Act was a great thing, and we gave them really dictatorial powers over the indigenous peoples of this country. The Indian Act is still in Canadian legislation, as a matter of fact. They did something else. There's one little line in the British North America Act that became the Constitution Act. I'll try to do this briefly. That regards indigenous people. It says, essentially, Indians and lands belonging to the Indians are a federal responsibility. Now, that doesn't seem like very much. It's one little throwaway line. It seems like a complete neglect, in fact, of the great indigenous presence. But that one clause, no other group gets identified. The Constitution didn't even give particular responsibility for French or for English or any other particular group. Or women, or fishermen in Nova Scotia or anybody else. That particular responsibility given to the federal government, that's what entrenched the treaty relationship in our Constitution. And it's still fundamental to our Constitution, much more fundamental than the Indian Act is. John A. McDonald, as one of the makers, there was a lot of people involved in drafting that Constitution, but John A. McDonald was involved in entrenching the treaty relationship right in the Constitution of Canada. I don't know what would have happened if they had said, well, the British had this idea about treaties, but we don't like that. Let's just can treaties. We're not going to make any treaties with anybody anymore. They probably had the power to get away with it, sort of militarily. They did entrench it. And I think the way forward in this country is not picking which statue is good to go. Well, we should do some of that. But removing every John A. McDonald statue is not going to be nearly as useful as beginning to address the treaty relationship. As Jim says, McDonald didn't live up to the treaty relationship. Absolutely true. We're not living up to the treaty relationship, either the treaty obligations. I think we need to, and that's why I think we could probably leave the McDonald statues around on the grounds that, as Annette GordonReed says, he did some terrible things, he did some things we can work with as well. And if we work with making the treaty relationship begin to work, then I think there might be less tension over those statues. I'm more interested in that than paint throwing.
I mean, if the treaties worked, Sir John A. MacDonald would still be a racist jerk. I mean, he really would. And I take your point about the BNA Act. In the Royal Proclamation of 1763, it also says the Indians shall not be molested and their lands cannot be negotiated away without talking to them. I mean, that wasn't the exact wording, but that was what was there. So if we're going, it sounds like we're slipping into an argument about presentism and that, the contemporaries of the time, well, everybody, maybe held these views and slavery was just this part of the status quo. And maybe racism towards Indians was just part of the status quo, which I think it was, you're right.
And is.
And is, absolutely. But prior to that, 100 years before that, was a royal proclamation written by a white man, the King of England, who said, the Indians shall not be molested. Absolutely. So, if we think about history as evolving, which I don't necessarily agree with, and I'm not a historian, but certainly presentism relies on an evolution of thought and how things change over time. And if 100 years before there's a recognition, don't molest the Indians and their lands, and 100 years later, policy is developed to molest the Indians and their lands, like very specifically and severely, then I can't excuse that away. I can't.
James, you want to come in on that?
Well, I was just going to say, from the Royal Proclamation, there's a recognition of Indigenous title. Like Indians, using the old school terminology, own the land. So any expansion of settler white society, whatever it might be, after 1763 required a treaty.
Absolutely.
So because there's an acknowledgement. So Indigenous rights, in the British legal tradition, common sense aside, stem from the first document of British sovereignty on this territory.
They do indeed.
Some of these are really easy calls. For example, Germany decided to take every statue of Hitler down, and you can't put a statue to Hitler up, and I'm not sure there's anybody in this audience or anywhere else, well, maybe a few, very disturbed people, but not many people are going to say that we ought to be allowed to put statues of Hitler up. Okay, that's an easy one.
Yeah.
The harder ones are some of the ones that we're dealing with right now. Okay, we've had a good, good look at Johnny McDonald here. Vanessa, how broadly do we want to cast the net here in terms of statues of, like Wilfrid Laurier, for example. Wilfrid Laurier, first French-Canadian Prime Minister, significant Prime Minister in the history of Canada, believed in a huge head tax on Chinese citizens to come over to Canada. It was a pretty racist policy.
Absolutely.
You want to take Laurier off the $5 bill? Do you want to take down statues named after Laurier? You want to take airports down named after Laurier? What do we do about that?
Well, again, I think it's a time when we can provide some education. And actually, Laurier is coming off the $5 bill, and I heard he's getting onto a higher denomination. So he's being promoted, actually, which is really interesting. I don't know if it's the 50 or the 100, and so is Sir Johnny McDonald. They're being promoted within the monetary system.
I think it might be demoted because there'll be fewer.
Well, then I thought of that. I said there'll be less in circulation.
That's right.
So maybe it's a wonderful thing. I don't know. But
Yeah.
no, I mean, I think that, again, as we continue to uncover and have other sorts of discourses come into the public audience, we need to be creative about how we recognize, and not idolize, but recognize. So I don't know that everybody was really thinking about Sir Johnny McDonald until the statue wars started. I don't know that the youth of Canada were like running around with Sir Johnny McDonald t-shirts. Like, I just don't think that that was happening. But now there's a really kind of deep discussion happening. And so it provides an opportunity to provide education. And I'm not necessarily for removing statues, although I agree it has to be a community decision, but making the statue more representative of the person. So maybe some of the bronze should be taken off of Sir Johnny McDonald in the waist. So maybe he might look a bit emaciated. Why would he look emaciated? Well, because he had a starvation policy that he ran in the prairies for a number of years that left many Métis people dead. So if we're going to portray people and recognize them, like, let's do it. I mean, let's really do it.
James.
Chris might be able to help me with the numbers, but there was a survey, I think it was in 2008, and there was some insane number of young Canadians, like 40%, didn't know who McDonald was. So at least we're knowing who McDonald is, right? Like that number's going up. I remember actually maybe a year and a half ago, there was somebody did a poll, and it was 69% of Canadians are in favor of keeping the statues. Okay? So a reporter phoned me and it's like, how do you feel about that? It's like, wait a minute, 69% want to keep it. That means 1 in 3 Canadians wants to take it down. I was actually shocked about that because if you would have had this discussion 10, 15 years ago, the number would be like,
maybe 90-10 or whatever.
Well, yeah, it would be tiny, like people in favor. So I think this is the thin edge of the, I completely think this is the thin edge of a bigger question. Like we're talking about statues, and here's one I propose for you guys, is that there's probably a continuum, as you said. So if everyone's familiar with Edward Cornwallis in Halifax. So Cornwallis actually had a scalping proclamation published, put a bounty on Mi'kmaq scalps, right? We have those documents. So, okay, in this debate over genocide, we don't have to really go there necessarily, but that is an openly genocidal policy. So the statue in Halifax, to my understanding, was only put up in the 1930s because they needed a centerpiece for the landscape design. If like they created that image. So Halifax has taken that, since,
They pulled it down.
They pulled it down, and I don't know where it is right now. The statue, and so I think there's actually a continuum. There's a big discussion about Jeffrey Amherst these days, right? A lot of people are very upset because he proposed using smallpox-infested blankets during the 7 Years' War. So that debate is ongoing. And I'll grant anybody, McDonald is a complicated figure. So if you got a place like Victoria, where you've got a progressive mayor, and her reconciliation project was to set up, I think it was called the Victoria Family. So the two First Nations, I guess encapsulated by Victoria, they spent months and months together having meals, building trust. And I'm paraphrasing, I wasn't actually there, but from my understanding, the McDonald statue was right at City Hall. So if I were in Victoria, when I'm going to pay my parking tickets, I would have to pass under the shadow of Prime Minister McDonald. So as trust was built up, one of the persons from the Victoria family said, you know, every time I walk under this statue, I'm reminded of my family going to residential school. Like, this is like, you know, it's not a distant, it's not a sterilized symbol. Like that hurt every time that person went in. So, you know, for some of us with white privilege, like, you know, those things, they affect us because they you know, impose a will on society. But for some people, that's a very visceral, day-to-day occurrence, like that kind of violence. So even the imagery of a statue, I can understand that. If somebody's upset by it, I think the absolute first step we can go on that trail for reconciliation is listening to what the people who are upset by it, listening to them and trying to internalize.
Well, let's do a real life example here.
Sure.
I saw it recently. I assume it's still there. In Gore Park in downtown Hamilton, there is one of the few remaining statues in this country of Sir Johnny McDonald. And it is quite a beautiful portrayal of McDonald looking very stately and, you know, prime ministerial and so on. Let's do a real life example here. What should we do about that? Christopher, start us off. What should we do about that situation? Never mind, take it down, leave it. What do you want to do?
I liked one of Jim's opening remarks where he said, those decisions are civic decisions. It should probably be the citizens of Hamilton and their representative that debate that. Maybe we should take it to show of hands on this question.
That's not a bad idea. All right, shall we do this? How many people here, let's go for a bunch of different options here. The statue of Sir John A. that's in Gore Park, how many people believe it ought to be simply taken down, crated away somewhere else? Hands up, please.
Okay.
Hands down. How many people would be opposed to that idea? Leave it where it is. Hands down. How many people would like to see a second sculpture that might address some of the issues that we've dealt with here? I think that's the largest number of hands. How about an additional plaque beside whatever's written there already saying, oh, and incidentally, the guy also was responsible for residential schools and so on and so forth. Okay, so you're trying to campaign here on that. I saw that. We're seeing the elements of a potential consensus here that perhaps could go to City Hall and do something about that.
You know, I've actually... My smartphone wouldn't direct me to Gore Park. I want to go check that statue out today. I haven't actually seen it in person. But I think there's actually a difference. Okay, it's the same image, okay? Vanessa, maybe you want to get in on this. But when that statue was put up, I think it was 1896. The country was literally grieving over the death of Prime Minister McDonald. The statue in Regina, which is 10 feet tall and a little cartoonish, okay, that was set up in 1967. And I think those are two different images. Like, I actually am more sympathetic to the one in Gore Park, if that's the one that was built in 1896, because that's an artifact of the time.
Yes.
Rather, like, even though it's the same image, like maybe somebody, you know, wants to get in on that.
Right. Vanessa, you wanted to say.
So here's a similar example. The Mush Hole, the Mohawk Institute, which is the longest running residential school in Canada. 30 minutes from here.
It's in Brantford.
In Brantford. We would call it Six Nations, but we'll say Brantford proper.
Good enough. Good point. I
Anyway.
happily stand corrected. Very good.
So,
All right.
anyway, yes, you know, that closed in 1969, and the community voted a few years ago about whether to take it down, to burn it down,
Right.
or to keep it as a living monument to what happened. And the community voted to keep it.
And turn it into a museum or something.
And turn it into a museum. But what they didn't do was leave it running, for example, as it were, as it was originally designed to do, as an idol to the Canadian state's dream of getting rid of the Indian and the child. It became a living, critical, educative structure that Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples can come into. So that colonial structure is still there, but it means something different. And I don't know that leaving Sir John A. McDonald statues as they are causes us to change our thinking or the thinking of future generations if we do not interact with it, if we do not require it to teach us about the bad things that happened under that sort of leadership and authority.
Status quo is not an option. We've got to do something more engaging,
absolutely.
More educational.
Yes.
Understood. Where is that? You know, last time I was at Six Nations was with Dave Levac,
yes,
who is the former Speaker of the Legislature, who himself has Métis heritage, and he has been, I think, instrumental in getting the money from the provincial government of the day to turn that into a museum.
Yeah.
He said he used to walk by it as a kid all the time. When he went to grade school, he had no clue
No
what was
idea.
going on in that building.
Right.
And that would not be an unusual experience, right?
Absolutely. But now people know when
Now
they walk
people know.
by.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I raise an issue here of something, and somebody raised the word earlier, but I think I've heard lots of talk about this, and so I think we ought to touch on it here. This notion of presentism. There is certainly a bit of backlash in society to the notion that we're going to judge yesterday's figures from our political history by the standards that we have today, our more enlightened, more sensitive standards to these things. And there has been a suggestion that it's really not very fair to judge McDonald, Laurier, whoever you want, by the sensitive 2019 standards. It's just not fair to do that to people who lived 150 and 200 years ago. Discuss. James, your view.
I'm not comfortable attempting to get into the headspace of someone who lived or died 150 years ago. I look at their actions. So actually, I wrote something for Active History a few years ago. Don't think of McDonald's motivation, just think about the legal aspects. So in the case of the prairie communities that signed Treaty 6, there was a guarantee of food assistance in a time of crisis written into the terms of the treaty. In fact, that was one of the main stumbling blocks, was a guarantee of food if the bison disappeared. Well, that was...
We did not live up to that.
No, McDonald went 180 degrees the other way. And so I've gotten into a polite debate with my senior colleague Don Smith from University of Calgary, who said, Jim, you're only looking at one aspect. You're only looking at the bad things he did. What about his discussion of possibly having the franchise for Haudenosaunee voters in Southern Ontario? Okay?
Which is also true.
Well, it happened for a few years, although while those folks were getting the franchise, the Haldeman Tract was being chipped away and chipped away. Their land was being taken, and that continues to be an issue.
He was also the first significant Canadian politician to champion the vote for women.
Yeah.
Didn't get it through, but he championed it.
So
could have got it through if he'd wanted to. Remember.
Okay.
Getting back to the First Nations thing, though, in my conversations with Dr. Smith, from my perspective, the fact that he could deal politically with the Haudenosaunee, who were surrounded by settlers and were no threat to imminent development, and literally he was cruel without exaggeration. Like, he acted in a cruel way, and it wasn't neglect, it was active. And so what he did that, and he was the minister, he's still the longest serving Minister of Indian Affairs in Canadian history, as he was the Prime Minister after 1878. So he personally oversaw the marginalization of Indigenous people, for sure, in the West. So in my conversation with Dr. Smith, that makes him worse, because he knew he could deal charitably, if you want to think about it, honorably, with one group, and another group that were in his way, he steamrolled.
Chris, what about this issue of presentism? Do you see much of that as a historian?
Sure. History gets rewritten in every generation. There wouldn't be work for us if it wasn't. History's written hundreds of years ago would be just fine if views didn't change. We're always looking at the past through new eyes, and that's what makes it interesting. That doesn't mean we can just say anything we want about the past, but we pick and choose. We edit history all the time. And when we pick the things that are important to us, we put aside the things that aren't important to us anymore.
Do you see any unfairness, though, in trying to judge people of 200 years ago by today's standards?
Well, I think you have to try to judge people of 200 years ago, and what other standard do you use? Yeah, they don't live up to the standards that we would have now.
Vanessa?
Well, I guess I would say two things. Your question relies, again, on an evolution of history, that we are a constantly evolving people as humankind, that we are getting better. And I don't know that can be applied necessarily. I don't know that Indigenous societies and our ways of conducting governance are better now than they were prior to contact. I don't know where we would be without contact. I don't know if things would have evolved or would have been maintained. I don't know, but I think it relies on this idea that things get better over time. And yeah, technology does, but I don't know that society gets better over time. And And secondly, I would say, I mean, what would happen if Sir John A. McDonald was brought into this present and had to grapple with these truths and maybe come face to face with some of the policies that he inflicted and imposed? Would he want statues of himself? And if he would, then it's not a problem of presentism. And if he wouldn't, then there's no more statue debate, because we would honor what he wants us to do. And that's what I would say.
Let me put one more issue on the table here for discussion, and then we'll get this audience involved in the conversation as well. From the New York Times, Southern cities ponder what to do with all these old statues. One city has settled on an unusual answer: sell the statue to the highest bidder. Dallas, unable to find a suitable new home for a bronze statue of Robert E. Lee on horseback that had sat in a city park until 2017, recently sent the artifact to an online auction. It sold for $1.4 million with one crucial condition: the statue cannot be displayed publicly in the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. This is a new and different approach to getting rid of statues that some people find problematic. Is this an option? Vanessa?
No, I mean, I think that creates like a private, to me, I imagine like a bunch of racists in a basement, like praying to this monument every other Friday or something, and I don't think that's a good idea. So I would say absolutely not. I don't think we should involve capitalism or anything. I mean, I think it could go to a museum if they were already removed. I think for those that stayed, again, I would say they need to be transformed in some way to reflect what the person did in all respects. Sure, celebrate, if you want, Sir Johnny McDonald in Canada. Again, assuming Canada is the greatest country in the world, you'd have to assume that. I don't assume that. But you'd also have to provide information on what else has happened. But no, I don't think private sales. I mean, I'm thinking about people, the person, Cornwallis and his scalps are probably sitting in someone's basement. I mean, they are.
James, what about it? Sell it to the highest bidder?
I don't know about selling it to the highest bidder, but maybe sending them to a museum, like even a safe space, having context, putting the statue in. This was our recollection of our vision of McDonald at Confederation, and Confederation really was a peak for this because a bunch of those statues were put up. But have that in context. Like when the statue in Regina was put up in 1967, the residential school system was running full on in Saskatchewan. You know what I mean? People had just gotten, in First Nations people had just gotten their citizenship 7 years earlier. So, the oppression, the marginalization wasn't subtle in those days. It was in our faces. Most people didn't recognize it.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what about putting Sir John A. up for auction on eBay?
What she said.
Yeah, thank you.
Listen, can I just broaden this a little bit? I don't know if you're in the audience. I take a little bit of a Republican stance in Canada. I see statues all over this country of George V and Victoria, and I kind of wish we had more Canadian statues. I kind of think the solution to that is let's have more Canadian statues.
Of who?
Well, there's a terrific statue of Al Purdy, the wonderful poet, in Queen's Park now. I think that's a great addition to our statuary. Aurelia put up a statue of Gordon Lightfoot not that long ago. Again, let's get away from these old white male politicians and get some of our artists and our creative people.
A nice statue of Ted Rogers at the Sky Dome.
In British Columbia, the dominant iconography of statues in much of British Columbia, I'm sure some of you have been through Vancouver Airport, it's all Indigenous. A lot of it's Bill Reid, but it's not only Bill Reid anymore. Robert Davidson, the Haida artist, a whole lot of them. We can improve our statuary a hell of a lot. And I think that puts us in debate with a previous generation that thought George V or the VI or whoever he is on the horse behind Queen's Park, that was the appropriate thing to put up. In 1967, John A. McDonald, but I think in 2019, there's more interesting choices we can make.
How about this, though? We're not far from where Joseph Brand was a significant figure in the history of our country. Got a hospital named after Joseph Brand. Should we put up a statue to Joseph Brand, only to find out at some point that a historian who looks back at his record may have found that he tortured some of his opponents back in the day, or some other awful thing, what do we do then?
Well, he'll be in good company then, with all the other statues. I mean, why do we have to have different standards than for Indigenous people, right? I mean, he'll be in good company, I suppose.
Okay, did you want to add anything to that?
I was watching a French-Canadian film in the hotel last night, and somebody at the bar in this French-Canadian film said, nobody builds a statue to somebody who didn't do something wrong to get ahead. So that, yeah, there's something to that.
Interesting. Okay. Who's got, now, where's Rena? I am reliably advised that there's the microphone right here. Okay. Now, do we have one for the balcony as well, or are the folks in the cheap seats out of luck? Okay. We have a microphone right here, so if anybody would like to get into this with a discussion, gentleman in the orange shirt right here. I knew I should have brought my glasses tonight. Anyway. Let's have nice questions as opposed to speeches. And if you'd like to direct it to anybody in particular, let us know.
Sego, I'm Daschuk from Six Nations. When I first saw the panel, I was very concerned that it was primarily white men with one Native woman. However, my knowledge of Mohawk women, she's going to outnumber you 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. My issue is that statutes are so European. If you truly want something Indigenous, perhaps we could do the polishing the silver covenant chain. And my question to the panel, we'll leave Vanessa to the last. Explain the significance of polishing the silver covenant chain, historians.
Ooh. Oh my. This is not my, I'm a historian of Western Canada, where the Haudenosaunee came west with the fur trade. To my knowledge, that would be reestablishing the relationship that was set with the chain. If you're polishing it, you're maintaining that relationship. Is that correct?
He is nodding his head.
You give me an opening to remind myself, we were talking about the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in which a British king asserted some certain things about who owned the land. A year later, there's a thing that often in European historiography is called the Treaty of Niagara, where basically a group of indigenous nations got together and talked about the terms on which they were going to deal with this new presence, the English, the British presence. There are wampum, as you know, there are covenant chains. There is, as you say, a whole iconography that expresses those issues and the indigenous interpretation of them. And I think you're absolutely right. We need to speak about those more, emphasize them more, polish them. Maybe the way to do it.
Vanessa.
So thanks for the question, Sego. The Silver Covenant Chain is it's a treaty. It's an international treaty made of wampum shells between the Haudenosaunee and first the Dutch and then the British. And in the treaty, there depicts a white man on one end and a Haudenosaunee person on the other, and in between them is a chain of silver. And if the white man ever needed help, he would pull on the chain, and I would feel that, and I would come to your aid. And if I pulled, you would feel that, and you would come to my nation's aid. And so it was about, the treaty relationship was about not just two forms of sovereignty, but that we were loyal to one another. We cared about one another. And so polishing it means that we are reaffirming, revitalizing that relationship.
Wonderful. Okay, who's next? Right here, please.
Just before I ask my question, I was wondering if I get a show of hands about how many in this audience are treaty people. With a show of hands, please.
Treaty people in the audience tonight?
In the audience,
hands
how
nice
many
and high,
treaty
so
people? Well, you see, we've got an issue there. Because we are all treaty people.
Thank you.
Just as you said about the silver chain. It is an arrangement and agreement. So it should be now, how many here are treaty people?
Yeah, mine does too.
Better. Okay, now my question is, since there's all sorts of other iconography, a great opportunity was given to Canadians by using the textbooks of our coinage this was mentioned in passing. The $10 bill was given Viola Desmond,
Yeah.
which seems strange that there's a greater references to First Nations and treaty people than to Viola Desmond. Well, with all due respect to Viola Desmond. Now, my question to the panel is, if there was one great negotiator, diplomat, who could be put on a Canadian bill, who would each member of the panel choose?
Interesting. Okay. This is from regardless. Settler, Indigenous, whatever. Okay. Chris, start us off.
I grew up in Vancouver, so I might lean to Chief Dan George, who in my youth and childhood was one of the few Indigenous leaders I was aware of, and I still remember the impact that he made. That's one suggestion.
James.
I gave a talk in Kingston about the McDonald statue. Actually, the law school at Queen's University is McDonald Hall, like Johnny McDonald Hall. And one of the things I talked about with the I guess the dissonant recognition was that's the territory that Daganawida came from, the great peacemaker. And so what I said was, well, McDonald, love him or hate him, 151, 152 years, but how long has the League of the Haudenosaunee gone on for? 600-700 years? And I rhetorically asked the law students, who's the greater diplomat, like Daganawida or Johnny McDonald? So I don't know if he'll ever make a bill, but that's somebody who comes to mind, because that alliance has stayed intact for literally centuries upon centuries.
Vanessa.
I think I would choose Daschuk or Levi General, who in 1924 visited the League of Nations to speak about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and he was blocked from doing so by Canada, even though he had 3 member nations who voted yes, and that's all you needed. So he went out into the town square, and the mayor of Geneva, who I guess really loved Native people, wanted to hear him speak, and so everyone came outside, and he gave this huge speech. He was banned from returning to Canada, seen his wife and family, and he died in Rochester. But before he did, he stated this amazing speech over the Rochester radio station the night before he died, a pluralisy, and he talked about feminism, and he talked about matriarchies, and he talked about carceral states using different language, and it was a very powerful speech. So that's who I'd choose.
You didn't ask my opinion, but I'm going to give it anyway. I'd give it to somebody who, when I was growing up in this city, was a pioneer, a leader, and a great, great man, Lincoln Alexander. That's what I'd do. Okay, next question, please. Right here in the middle.
Thank you. Yes, my idea was to leave the statues up, but also erect statues across the country and create parks, history parks in each city. We already have one in Hamilton, our Gore Park, and we also have honored the contributions to the wars, and we have statues there, and we have lots of room to add Indigenous people also. And I just wonder if other cities across the country could do the same with their statues and create history parks.
Anything like that in Regina that you know of?
Not yet. In fact, just 10 days ago, the cemetery of the Regina Indian Industrial School, ownership of that land was just handed to the commemoration committee. But that took 5 or 6 years of negotiations, very slow negotiation. The cemetery, I think there were 36, I'm going to use the archaeological term, site disturbances in this area. The story was almost lost. And so there's a group of actually former Presbyterian church members, like it was the Presbyterian church that ran the residential school. They literally combed through the archives and found who some of those children who died. But the process literally took years. So, I've commented to other people, if those were white kids lying in that field, that would have been a cemetery so quick, people's heads would have spun.
Right.
So I think we're working on it, but turning that ship around is taking time and conflict.
Either of you two want a word on this? Don't feel obliged to. We can go back to the audience. No?
No, I think her point's a good one.
I think it's a good one.
Terrific. Next, please. Yes, right here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm an academic, so I want to thank you on one hand and then pick a fight with you all on the other. The discussion on presentism was excellent, but I also would like to hear a comment from you on reductionism. Sir Johnny McDonald acted on behalf of the Eastern Capital. If it was not Sir Johnny McDonald, it would have been someone else. So I'd like to get a comment from you on that. Secondly, I'd like a comment on the issue of Canada being the greatest country in the world, this being July 4th. Cecil Foster gave a talk at Brock University in February, and he identified that the Southern Confederate leaders profoundly influenced Sir Johnny McDonald and others in Canada. And in fact, they were advised by them, and many of them were given comfort in Canada. So if Canada is the greatest country in the world, why was it so profoundly influenced by the Confederacy?
Who can speak to that?
You want to go with that one?
Chris, I see you mulling.
A lot of Canadians, a surprising number of Canadians served almost overwhelmingly in the Union forces, and Canada was generally allied with the Union. There were certainly concerns in British North America in the process of becoming Canada that if the Union won the Civil War with this enormous army that it was building up, it would be pretty easy to turn them around and send them across the 49th parallel, or metaphorically the 49th parallel. So there were reasons for Canadian statesmen to not be super happy about the North winning and becoming the continental superpower. But I think in general, Canadian sentiment was much more with the Northern sentiment than the Southern sentiment. I don't see a huge influence of Southern Confederate ideas in the forming of the Confederation document. I just don't.
Chris, wasn't Confederacy a tip of the hat to, or the Confederation was a tip of the hat to Confederacy?
There's actually a great wrangle about why it's a confederation and not a federation. Okay. It's so arcane about who made that decision and slipped that word in that I hardly want to open it up, and I'd need a textbook in front of me to help me.
I'd never heard that before. Is that right? You think the word confederation?
I've heard that interpretation. Like that's why we have, like think about it, right? The Confederates were pretty in the newspapers in 1865. Up to just a comment about Eastern Capital. I totally agree with you. Something to think about. The completion. Okay, so McDonald took on the portfolio as Prime Minister, but also, as I said, the longest-serving Minister of Indian Affairs in Canadian history. And in his correspondence, he said, solving the Indian issue or Indian affairs is so important to me, I can't entrust it to anyone else. That was his second issue. His primary objective was building the railway. So it's symbolic. I'm not a real literary person, but within weeks of the largest mass execution in Canadian history, 6 Cree and 2 Assiniboine men, all at the same time in Battleford, the hanging of Louis Riel, and the last spike, they all took place at the same time, and the imposition of the pass system. So that last spike was, I think about a nail in the coffin for the freedom of Indigenous people. I'm with you, sir. Like, the completion of the railway completely changed the game.
Yeah, and I would just add that to your point about, the pass system was not part of the Indian Act.
No.
The pass system was not a part of the Constitution. McDonald was not following policy with the pass system. He introduced an illegal system that prevented people from leaving the reserve, preventing people from selling goods off reserve, to therefore support his starvation policy, which he was enacting across the prairies. I don't know that just anybody would do that. Invent that system, support that system when it's not just following policy of the time. He was not. He introduced it.
Can I just, our speaker's absolutely right in the point that what was happening in Canada, we know what was happening to Indigenous people in Australia, even vaguely, in Mexico, in South America, in South Africa. It was not a uniquely Canadian thing, shall we say. But I think we on the panel feel that that doesn't excuse Johnny. The issue of Johnny McDonald and his responsibility can still be debated. Just because it was a global phenomenon of, I shouldn't say just, it was a global phenomenon of the expanding world system. But I think we can still debate and consider the responsibility of individual Canadians like Johnny McDonald.
James?
Just talking about, you mentioned Wilfrid Laurier, or Steve mentioned Wilfrid Laurier. So a lot of people said, well, what about Laurier if you're going to vilify McDonald? So one of the things I think about, because I've sort of spent a lot of time in that time period, was by 1885, First Nations people out west, at least, were so locked down, the marginalization was so institutionalized that it was literally off the radar from any other politician until probably just the last generation or so. All of those policies, residential schools, they weren't coming up in Parliament for discussion because they were locked in. So it's almost like, you know, should we vilify someone who's a slave owner? Well, if you're a slave owner, maybe you're a man, or I guess, yeah, probably a man, not a woman, of your time. But if you invented slavery, maybe you have a special responsibility. So I think part of the deal with McDonald is he established that relationship as the Minister of Indian Affairs, and by his own pen, it was so important to him that he didn't entrust it to anyone else. So he took personal responsibility for it.
He did not bring in the Indian Act, though, right?
No, he didn't. That was under the Liberal government.
Alexander Mackenzie.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. But he did love it. He did love it.
He did love it, but he didn't bring it in.
Loved it.
Yeah. Who's next? Okay, in the back there, and then we'll come down to the middle here.
Thank you. Sometimes I think it's whose ox is getting gored. For example, I believe it was 1645-46 when the Iroquois came and committed genocide against the Hurons, wiping them out right up to the, up to Georgian Bay. They then turned around, and I think in about 1648, they knocked out the neutrals and completely wiped those guys out. Well, then along came Joseph Brant with 106 slaves, and if you want to talk about pedophilia, he had a 16-year-old girl in that place out in Burlington. These were slaves he brought up from the United States when they were granted the land after the American Revolution. So, you know, you want to talk about whose statue is going to get wiped out and whose image is going to be tarnished. I want to see Brantford wiped out. I want to see Joseph Brant hospital name wiped out. I want Brant County wiped out. I don't know where you want to go with this, but as far as I'm concerned, it's 2019. I'm a Canadian. We're all Canadians. Let's get started on appreciating this country with the potential we have, not for this rather whose ox is getting gored history. Thank you.
Well, I don't know. I mean, like, you know, the facts of everything you're saying, especially with regard to the pedophilia. But again, I would say, I mean, if you're then saying that Joseph Brant or the Iroquois committed genocide, which I don't know about, but if they did, I mean, you're equating that Canada committed genocide because you're comparing the two in terms of statues, at which point I would say then Joseph Brant should have a statue, I suppose. I mean, I don't know.
Can I also, let me pick up on the last thing you said there, because you said something, well, you said a lot of very controversial things, but the last thing you said might have been one of the more controversial things, which is, we're all Canadians, and therefore ... I've talked a lot of Indigenous people who do not think of themselves as Canadians, and using this metaphor, they think, you know, okay, we're in the same physical space, but it's like we're in two canoes going down the river together, but they're two different canoes.
Yeah.
We're not all in the same boat. We may be tracking a parallel line, but we're not in the same boat. Where's my question here? Well, again, do you consider yourself a Canadian?
I consider myself an Anishinaabe and Ganyankihaga. Yeah.
Okay,
And I live in a nation called Canada, and I have a Canadian passport so that I can go where I need to go.
Vote and go and do the...
But I don't vote in federal elections. I mean, I did once for the NDP. So if I had to again, I would for the NDP.
Okay. But would you say most Indigenous people in this country do not consider themselves Canadians?
I wouldn't say most. I would say there is two sides. I would say there's two kind of polarized views. You are or you're not.
Right.
And there are quite a few Indigenous folks who say they are not because Canada's sovereignty derives from the recognition of our multiple sovereignties.
I just thought it was useful to put that on the record. Okay.
Thanks.
I'd like to say, along with the questioner, I identify myself as a Canadian. I don't have any other country to identify with. But it doesn't mean we haven't got issues to deal with, including the issues we've been challenged with, that we're all being challenged with today. I think they're worth addressing, and addressing them makes me more proud to be a Canadian than otherwise, I guess.
Good. Let's do a few more questions. I saw one hand here. I saw a hand down here, and is that a hand? No, you were just scratching your head. Okay.
Watch that.
And this gentleman here. So 1, 2, 3, and then we'll go have some refreshments.
Not a question, but a comment. Should we take these statues and put them in a warehouse and never see them again? And I think that's a tremendous lost opportunity, because the fact that you can walk by and someone's going to say, oh, who's that? Well, Johnny McDonald, founder of the country, etc. But here's the other story. I like the idea of the 2 plaques or the opposing statues, and I think there was fairly general consensus on that. And I compare it to if you're going through a concentration camp in Dachau, there's nothing like seeing the real thing versus punching up a little story on an iPad in a very sterile museum. You're there walking on the same ground, you're seeing the same buildings. And I was a grade 6 teacher, and Indigenous Studies was part of the curriculum. I took the kids out to Brantford to the Woodland Cultural Center. And I can read everything out of textbooks and show them PowerPoints, but they start to glaze over, probably because they're tired of hearing me talk. But to hear Indigenous people tell the stories and to show them artifacts and to walk in those buildings. And there was a residential school there. I'm not sure if that was the one that was talked about.
Yep, the Mohawk
We
Institute.
walked through that building, and it was very, very impactful. You go down the basement, you just wonder what sort of horrors went on there. And you can't get that out of a textbook. So to destroy those things is to almost eradicate or deny history, and a huge lost opportunity.
Okay.
I agree.
Next was up here. Thank you, sir. Yes, your turn.
Before I came this evening, I just did a quick look at the Truth and Reconciliation study and some of the recommendations. And what really struck me about it was how conciliatory the language was.
Yeah.
It was really a wonderful thing to read. It was really the authors putting a hand out to Canada, the way I saw it. We call on the government to do this and that, and it was really good to see. And it's interesting. I guess my question really is, and I'll just say one other thing, looking at the definition of reconciliation, which is to restore friendship between people after a quarrel or estrangement, is discussions like this tonight, I know they're important, but I guess the broad question is this moving us towards reconciliation, or is it a step backward? I'm hearing things like Confederate soldiers and statues being painted on as a regular basis of it's no big deal. I just get a niggling feeling that I don't know if this is moving forward or backwards. I'd appreciate some comments.
Great. Let's ask the question. Do we make any progress tonight?
We did, because I think before reconciliation is truth. And I think that often when we talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we've kind of gotten to the habit of talking about reconciliation and not talking so much about truth. And I think, if we keep talking about truth, then we will get to a place where that hand can be extended and held back, and we can start to talk more about those things. Now, in terms of the statues, part of transforming statues is to tell the truth about the statues. And then maybe we can think about how to interact and engage more truthfully with our own histories and with the statues. So I do think it's progressive. I don't think that throwing paint on a statue, I'm not saying everybody go down to Gore Park. We're all going to Gore Park after this. But what I'm saying is, if somebody does that, I don't have that sort of reaction that's like they should be arrested. That's a form of violence. Because I'm thinking about the truth of Sir Johnny McDonald. So that's where it resonates with me. And until we get more truth out and circulating, we're going to have these sorts of triggers that circulate.
Chris, any progress made tonight?
Well, I think that should be up to the audience more than us, but I'm a little biased sitting here. But yeah, I think these issues are worth discussing, and ultimately they make it better and not worse. I think we can deal with we can face these issues. Reconciliation, I want to say two things. First of all, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made thousands and thousands of pages of reports, but the final report, which is one volume, it's widely available as a paperback. You could get free copies from the government or from the commission at one point. I'm not sure if you still can. It's in the libraries. It's powerful reading, but it's valuable and insightful reading, and the recommendations at the end are worth reading. None of the 94 recommendations say anything about taking statues down, actually. And I forget what the other point was.
And Commissioner St. Clair actually said not
right.
to, like, he wasn't in favor of taking statues down. So in addition to calling on the government, the commissioners, I think, were very wise, because what they've done is they call on citizens. It's not like I'm a historian, so we go to government docks and blow the dust off royal commissions and do our work. Well, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, those calls to action were that puts it on each and every one of us to do something. And as I've told my students, there's 94 of them. So something will apply to your life, to your sphere of influence, whether you run a business, whether you're an educator, whether you're a health professional or something like that. And I've been, Saskatchewan is a tough place, because in a lot of ways, I guess everywhere is kind of like an open wound with regard to race relations. But at Saskatchewan, if you guys want to think about this, 16-17% of our population is First Nations or Métis. And 2015, somebody did a study, and 66% of First Nations children lived under the poverty line. That's like you can cleave that along racial lines. So as the gentleman said in the back, we're all Canadians, but we're living in different worlds. So one of the things, we talk about reconciliation, but we got to get to truth, we got to get to justice. And then maybe instead of reconciliation being on a Thursday night, okay, we can go to the farmer's market tomorrow. This is a relationship. So one of the things I do with my students is I actually have 5% as an out-of-class experience. They're predominantly non-Indigenous. So they go to First Nations events. We have ceremony, we have feasts and that kind of thing. They get to make a friend. That's probably the biggest thing you can do, is just interact with your neighbors.
You have reminded me that a couple of Fridays ago on this show I do on TVO called The Agenda, we had an interview with a 31-year-old broadcaster activist named Serene Fox, and she is awfully bloody impressive. And she said, I'm less interested in reconciliation, and I'm very interested, apropos of what you just said, in reconciliation. That was the word she used. You had one little letter, it makes a whole bunch of difference. Okay, last question over here, please.
Thank you. I would like to broaden this discussion to a global one, because I've been thinking about the British Empire and Queen Victoria, who came to the throne in 1837 while Canada was still a colony in Newfoundland and South Africa and etc. We now know that the British Empire was a very bloody empire, did horrendous things all over the world. So should the statue of Queen Victoria be removed? It's downtown. And all the rest of the statues of Queen Victoria.
Well, we're at it. I mean, it's called Queen's Park after her. Should we change the name of Queen's Park?
I'd like an answer to my question.
Go ahead.
So, in Six Nations, we have this tradition. It's called bread and cheese. And every year on Victoria Day, we have a big parade and rides, and through the lacrosse arena, pieces of bread and cheese are handed out to every community member for free. And this was part of Queen Victoria's, what she did back during the time of her reign, for her to thank the Indians, the Iroquois in particular, for their loyalty in wartime. She gave out bread and cheese to the Indians. And so we don't really talk about Queen Victoria that day, but we do eat a lot. So I don't know. I mean, that's one way, but it happens on Victoria Day. So, and it extends from a relationship with Victoria, which was about the Silver Covenant chain, which was about maintaining a relationship where if she pulled, we responded. And in return for that, she gave us some bread and cheese. We're still waiting for, I think, their response, maybe a bit more. But she is part of a living culture, for us anyway, and we do commemorate her in our own way, and it's based on that treaty relationship.
Queen Victoria, James?
One of the things out west is, I don't know about all First Nations, but when there's an issue, the issue is with the Crown. Like my spouse works for the provincial government of Saskatchewan. They recognize it, but like it's not part of the treaty relationship, it's with the Crown. So the Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Territories was the Queen's representative. That's who the deal was made with. So I totally get your point, sir. I'm just putting it in a global context. Cecil Rhodes, do you know about the statue at University of Cape Town? Somebody a black African student just had enough of walking by Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, like he was in a place of honor.
Father of apartheid.
Yeah, and so he was, as I tell my students, he was so humble, he named the country after himself, right? Rhodesia.
Rhodesia,
and, so the student threw a bucket of poop on this statue, like just as an inarticulate, sign of frustration. Within weeks, there were thousands of people gathering at that locus of conflict, and at the University of Cape Town, they took the statue down for its own protection. Now, Rhodes was so successful, as we know, he set up a college at Oxford, and they decided at Oxford, after a whole bunch of very prim and proper debates, not to take down the statue at the college he built, but rather than to put a new and improved, an alternative interpretation on the plaque. So there's different ways, but this is a global process. But we in Canada have pretensions to being a decent and honorable country. So if we're to live up to that standard, if we're to act on those things, we've got to deal with those injustice issues, like the 66% of First Nations kids and kids who are in foster care and that kind of thing. So ultimately, this is just the start. There are going to be people on this stage potentially for years working out these issues. Because once we get to things like land and justice and the redistribution of wealth, we're going to dream about statues.
Chris, you want the last word?
I think that's a very good last word. I think we do have big issues about land and government and distribution of wealth, and I think I hope we're tiptoeing towards them, but they're going to be huge compared to the statues issue. But the statues issue is a good way to introduce ourselves to a lot of these issues. I like the debate more than I like the removal, but there we are.
Gotcha. Where's Rena?
Right here.
You going to come up and close this thing off? Okay.
I would just love to thank our wonderful panelists, thoughtful, funny, engaging, sparky. And thank you, this wonderful audience. Of course, thank former Chancellor Wilson, and I hope you will stick around, have a cup of coffee, and keep talking about this. And we'll look forward to seeing you next year for a whole new season of Socrates events. Thank you.
Thank you.